Luxembourg City stood wrapped in winter's grip on December 20th, 1944, when a telephone conversation would expose fractures running deep through the Allied command structure. General Omar Bradley, his hand clenched around the receiver until his knuckles showed white against the black bakelite, listened as the Supreme Commander delivered orders that tested every boundary of their professional relationship and personal friendship. Two entire American armies, formations comprising hundreds of thousands of men, were being transferred to British control. More specifically, they were being placed under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Bradley's response erupted with force rarely seen from the normally composed Missouri officer. The words came sharp and definitive. He could not accept responsibility to the American people for such a decision. He would resign his command rather than see American forces subordinated this way. The declaration hung in the air, a challenge that might shatter the alliance at its most critical moment. Dwight Eisenhower's reply carried the cold precision of absolute authority. The responsibility belonged to him alone, not to Bradley. Therefore, Bradley's threatened resignation carried no weight whatsoever. The conversation ended with Bradley's compliance, but the damage to relationships within the Allied command had deepened irreversibly. This moment, occurring amid the chaos of the German Ardennes offensive, crystallized years of accumulated frustration that American commanders had experienced dealing with Britain's most prominent battlefield leader. Montgomery stood as victor of El Alamein, the desert triumph that had reversed British fortunes in North Africa. The British public revered him. Churchill valued him as one of the few commanders who delivered victories when Britain desperately needed them. Yet within American headquarters, from the dusty expanses of Tunisia to the industrial heartland of Germany, Montgomery had become the most divisive figure in the entire Allied command structure. The question haunting American military leaders was straightforward yet profound. How could an alliance united against fascist tyranny find itself torn apart not by enemy action, but by the personality and conduct of one individual? The answer emerged not from isolated incidents, but from an accumulation of moments, decisions, and confrontations stretching across 2 years and multiple theatres of war. This represented the story of how military brilliance transformed into military liability, how national pride collided with alliance requirements, and how American commanders came to view their most prominent British counterpart with emotions spanning from exasperation to something approaching genuine hatred. The narrative began in North African sand and concluded in Northwest European mud, tracing a path of increasing bitterness and deteriorating relationships. The fundamental mathematics of Allied command appeared deceptively simple, while remaining politically complex. By late 1944, American military forces in Europe substantially outnumbered British and Canadian troops. American industrial production dwarfed Britain's war-strained economy by margins that grew larger with each passing month. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air power dominated European skies. Yet Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery seemed constitutionally incapable of acknowledging these realities or modifying his behavior to account for them. To American eyes, Montgomery embodied everything their revolution had been fought to escape: aristocratic presumption, imperial condescension, and an unshakable conviction of British superiority. But Montgomery defied simple caricature. His brilliance was genuine, his preparation meticulous, his concern for soldiers' lives sincere in ways that earned deep loyalty from British troops. His victories were real achievements, his tactical judgment demonstrably sound. British soldiers, battered by early war defeats at Dunkirk and in the desert, had found in Montgomery a commander who won battles while keeping casualty lists manageable. Churchill treasured him as a rare commodity in dark times. The British public adored him as a national hero. None of this mattered to American commanders who found themselves repeatedly marginalized, patronized, and publicly diminished by a field marshal who appeared to view them as enthusiastic but untutored amateurs requiring patient British guidance. The friction emerged not from grand strategic disagreements about how to defeat Germany, but from something far more personal and corrosive: respect, or rather its conspicuous absence. From initial encounters in North African desert campaigns through the final victory in Germany, American commanders discovered that Montgomery's treatment of them revealed deep assumptions about American competence, courage, and fundamental worth that cut deeper than any battlefield disagreement possibly could. March 6, 1943, found Tunisia's desert wind carrying the acrid smell of burned vehicles and the bitter taste of defeat across landscapes recently contested in fierce combat. Lieutenant General George Patton stepped from his aircraft, arriving to assume command of the battered Second Corps. 20 days earlier, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had savaged American units in their first major engagement against veteran Wehrmacht troops. The defeat at Kasserine Pass had been comprehensive, humiliating, and brutally instructive about the gap between training and combat reality. What greeted Patton transcended mere demoralization. He encountered a British command structure that viewed American forces as unreliable auxiliaries requiring careful supervision before they could be trusted with significant combat responsibilities. General Sir Harold Alexander, commanding the newly established 18th Army Group that oversaw all Allied ground forces in Tunisia, had drafted assessments of American combat performance that read like formal indictments. American commanders lacked adequate experience. American troops demonstrated insufficient discipline. American units required extensive British oversight before earning trust for important missions. The assessment was not entirely unjustified. Kasserine Pass had exposed genuine deficiencies in American leadership, tactical coordination, and combined arms doctrine. Green troops had faced veteran German forces under commanders who understood desert warfare's unique demands. The Americans had learned painful lessons about the cost of inexperience. But Alexander's response extended beyond corrective criticism into something more problematic. In his judgment, Second Corps should be assigned supporting roles while British forces executed primary offensive operations against remaining Axis positions in Tunisia. Patton grasped immediately what was at stake in this arrangement. The upcoming campaign was not merely about defeating Rommel's Africa Corps and securing North Africa. It was about establishing whether American arms could stand alongside British forces as genuine equals worthy of respect. His diary entries from this period documented mounting frustration with British presumption and his determination to prove American worth through aggressive action regardless of cost. Montgomery, commanding British 8th Army as it approached Tunisia from the east after its long pursuit across Libya, embodied the British assumptions Patton increasingly resented. The victor of El Alamein carried himself with the confidence of a commander who had fundamentally reversed Britain's fortunes in the Desert Campaign. He had driven Rommel back across North Africa through methodical, carefully prepared operations, emphasizing overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical brilliance or operational daring. His soldiers trusted him because he won without squandering their lives needlessly in futile attacks. But his manner consistently suggested that he alone truly understood modern warfare's requirements, and that others, particularly Americans, had much to learn before they could be considered competent practitioners of military art. Alexander's operational plan for Tunisia's final campaign reflected these underlying assumptions about relative capabilities. Montgomery's 8th Army would deliver the primary blow against the Mareth Line, the Axis fortifications defending southern Tunisia. Patton's Second Corps would conduct supporting attacks designed to draw German attention and reserves away from Montgomery's main effort. The Americans would serve essentially as Montgomery's shield, while British forces won the glory of breaking through to Tunis and ending the North African campaign. The plan possessed military logic that was difficult to dispute. Montgomery commanded veteran troops with proven success against German armour in desert conditions. Patton led formations still learning their trade through bitter experience. But the allocation of missions carried implications extending far beyond tactical prudence. It established patterns and expectations that would haunt American commanders throughout the remainder of the war. British forces taking the lead, American forces providing support, British commanders receiving credit while American achievements went unnoticed or minimized in official accounts and press coverage. Patton launched his offensive toward El Guettar on March 17, 1943, determined to prove American competence through the most aggressive action his forces could sustain. His orders to subordinate commanders reflected his personality's distinctive combination of tactical guidance and demands for aggressive leadership at all levels. Officers would lead from the front. Troops would demonstrate the same aggressive spirit that had characterized American entry into the previous World War. Whatever the cost in casualties, Second Corps would demonstrate that it deserved treatment as a combat force rather than occupation troops suitable only for rear area duties. The Battle of El Guettar provided dramatic vindication for Patton's approach. On March 23rd, 50 German tanks belonging to 10th Panzer Division emerged from mountain passes into the valley floor, executing a dawn attack designed to shatter American defensive positions. What followed shocked German commanders accustomed to easy victories over inexperienced opponents. American artillery, emplaced with careful attention to overlapping fields of fire, unleashed devastating concentrations on advancing armour. Tank destroyer battalions, positioned to exploit terrain advantages, engaged panzers at ranges that negated German advantages in armour protection and gun performance. By day's end, the battlefield was littered with destroyed German vehicles, and 10th Panzer Division had been stopped cold in the most decisive defeat it had yet experienced in North African fighting. For the first time in the Mediterranean theatre, American forces had defeated experienced German armoured units in sustained combat. The psychological impact on both sides was profound, but the victory carried a bitter aftertaste that poisoned American commanders' satisfaction. Alexander's headquarters, focused intently on Montgomery's operations against the Mareth Line, paid minimal attention to Second Corps' success. British staff officers continued issuing detailed instructions to Patton, micromanaging American operations in ways that suggested persistent doubts about American competence persisting despite battlefield evidence to the contrary. More galling still, Alexander repeatedly changed Second Corps' objectives, shifting priorities in ways that appeared designed primarily to ensure American forces remained auxiliary to British operations, rather than pursuing independent objectives that might compete for attention and resources. Patton would be ordered to advance, then halt, attack with armour, then lead with infantry. Each change disrupted American operations and signalled unmistakably that Second Corps existed primarily to facilitate Montgomery's plans, rather than to achieve objectives of independent strategic value. When Montgomery finally attacked the Mareth Line on March 20th, his initial assault made limited progress against determined German resistance. He demonstrated flexibility by shifting his main effort to an outflanking manoeuvre through terrain initially considered unsuitable for large-scale armoured operations. But the modification required time, allowing German forces to establish new defensive positions. By the time 8th Army broke through, the opportunity for decisive pursuit had passed, and the campaign devolved into a grinding advance as Axis forces conducted skillful delaying actions. Second Corps continued its supporting attacks in central Tunisia, drawing German reserves away from Montgomery's front exactly as planned. American forces advanced steadily, taking objectives and inflicting significant casualties on Axis forces. But these achievements went largely unacknowledged in British reporting and press coverage. Montgomery's breakthrough received extensive publicity in British and American newspapers. Patton's equally important contribution to the overall campaign merited minimal mention, appearing as footnotes in accounts that centred British achievements. When Allied commanders held a victory parade in Tunis on May 20, 1943, with Eisenhower, Alexander, and French General Henri Giraud taking the salute, the official narrative emphasised British and French achievements while according American contributions only cursory acknowledgement. For American commanders witnessing this ceremony, the message was unmistakable. Fighting alongside the British meant fighting for recognition as well as victory. Tunisia provided lessons extending far beyond tactics and logistics. American commanders learned that Montgomery, whatever his military talents, seemed incapable of treating American forces as genuine partners, rather than promising apprentices requiring patient guidance. They began suspecting that this attitude reflected not merely Montgomery's personal eccentricities, but a broader British unwillingness to accept that the balance of power within the alliance had shifted irrevocably toward Washington. These lessons would prove disturbingly prophetic as the Allies turned their attention to the next major operation, the invasion of Sicily. July 10, 1943, witnessed the largest amphibious assault yet attempted in military history as Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, commenced in darkness and heavy seas. Over 8 divisions, divided between Montgomery's British 8th Army and Patton's American 7th Army, stormed beaches stretching from Cape Passero to Syracuse in an operation testing Allied unity as thoroughly as it tested Axis defences. The plan for Husky had been contentious from its inception, exposing fundamental disagreements about operational principles. Initial proposals envisioned landings dispersed across Sicily, seizing multiple ports quickly to ensure adequate supply for subsequent inland operations. Montgomery detested dispersed landings with an intensity bordering on obsession. His North African experience had convinced him that concentration of force was paramount, that scattering troops across wide areas invited defeat in detail by mobile defenders. On April 24, 1943, Montgomery articulated his objections and proposed an alternative that would fundamentally reshape the invasion. Concentrate all landings on Sicily's southeastern corner, giving 8th Army the clear mission of driving straight north to Messina, the island's northeastern port and gateway to mainland Italy. 7th Army would protect 8th Army's left flank and rear areas, providing security while Montgomery's forces pursued what he assumed would be a demoralized enemy. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, responsible for air and naval operations respectively, opposed Montgomery's plan with vigorous objections. Concentrated landings would leave 13 Axis airfields operational in western Sicily, posing unacceptable risks to the invasion fleet. Ships would remain concentrated in limited waters, vulnerable to air attack for extended periods. Their objections carried substantial weight, as both men commanded respect earned through successful operations in difficult circumstances. Montgomery's response revealed his personality's full force. He threatened to resign rather than execute a plan he considered fundamentally flawed, and he made clear that he enjoyed Churchill's backing in this dispute. Faced with a crisis threatening to derail the entire invasion, Eisenhower called a conference for May 2nd to resolve the dispute before it fractured Allied command relationships beyond repair. The meeting exposed fault lines that would widen throughout the war's remainder. Montgomery presented his case with confidence bordering on arrogance, dismissing objections as reflecting insufficient understanding of ground combat realities. Tedder and Cunningham defended the importance of securing airfields and protecting the fleet, arguing that Montgomery's plans subordinated air and naval considerations to ground force preferences. Eisenhower, attempting to balance military necessities against coalition politics, ultimately sided with Montgomery. The landings would be concentrated in southeastern Sicily, with 8th Army driving toward Messina and 7th Army protecting 8th Army's western flank. For Patton, studying the final plan while preparing his command for combat, the implications were unmistakable and infuriating. 7th Army would play a supporting role. Montgomery would lead the main attack. British forces would take Messina while Americans guarded their flank. Once again, American forces were relegated to secondary missions while British commanders pursued glory and newspaper headlines. The decision rankled for reasons transcending Patton's considerable ego. By July 1943, American forces in the Mediterranean theatre had grown substantially. 7th Army comprised 3 infantry divisions, an armoured division, and substantial support troops. a force comparable in size to 8th Army. American industrial output was flooding Allied stockpiles with equipment. American air power dominated Mediterranean skies. Yet the command structure treated American forces as auxiliaries to be employed at British discretion for British objectives. Patton's diary entry from July 12th captured his frustration with brutal clarity. Alexander and his entirely British staff had visited 7th Army headquarters to present the operational plan that, in Patton's view, cut Americans off from any possibility of taking Messina. He noted bitterly that Alexander, commanding both British and American armies, arrived with no American officers on his staff. The entry concluded with a damning assessment. "What fools we are," Patton wrote, recognizing that American political leaders had accepted command arrangements guaranteeing American marginalization. The landings proceeded reasonably well despite chaotic airborne operations that scattered British and American paratroopers across the countryside, with many drowning when their gliders crashed into the Mediterranean. By dawn on July 10th, both armies had secured beachheads and were pushing inland. Initial resistance from Italian coastal divisions crumbled quickly. German counterattacks against Gela Beach, where 7th Army landed, were defeated through combination of naval gunfire and determined fighting by 1st Infantry Division. Montgomery, confident that Axis resistance would collapse before methodical British pressure, signalled Alexander that the route to Messina lay open. His 8th Army would drive straight up the eastern coast. 7th Army should hold defensively, protecting 8th Army's flank while Montgomery pursued what he assumed would be demoralized enemies. The signal revealed Montgomery's fundamental assumptions about respective capabilities. British forces would deliver the knockout blow, American forces would provide security. Reality intruded swiftly and unforgivingly. German forces, far from collapsing, established strong defensive positions exploiting Sicily's mountainous terrain with professional skill. 8th Army's advance along the coastal road encountered determined resistance. Progress slowed to grinding advances measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Montgomery's methodical approach, so successful against Rommel in open desert, proved less effective against prepared defences in mountainous terrain. On July 13th, Montgomery proposed that 8th Army expand its operational area westward, effectively commandeering a key road assigned to 7th Army for its northward advance. The expanded frontage would allow him to outflank German positions, blocking his coastal advance. American forces should halt and defend while 8th Army executed the maneuver that would cut Sicily in half. The signal's tone proved as significant as its content. Montgomery did not request Alexander's approval for commandeering American operational areas. He informed Alexander of his intentions and suggested American forces adjust accordingly. The presumption was staggering in its implications. Montgomery was proposing to appropriate American operational zones, relegate American forces to static defense, and execute a strategy ensuring British forces alone would gain credit for Sicily's conquest. Alexander, whose admiration for Montgomery outweighed his confidence in American commanders, agreed without consulting Patton. On July 13th, he issued orders assigning Montgomery the disputed road and instructing 7th Army to hold defensively while 8th Army advanced. For American commanders reading these orders, the message was unmistakable. British preferences would determine Allied strategy regardless of American contributions or demonstrated capabilities. Patton's initial response demonstrated the political constraints frustrating American commanders throughout the war. Despite fury expressed in diary entries comparing Montgomery to an arrogant prima donna and Alexander to an incompetent sycophant, Patton formally accepted the order without protest. He understood that Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean, could not afford open revolt by subordinate commanders. Coalition warfare required compromise and accommodation, even when compromise meant swallowing justified anger. But Patton had no intention of allowing 7th Army to sit idle while Montgomery pursued victory. If Alexander would not assign Americans a primary mission, Patton would create one through audacity and initiative. He flew to Alexander's headquarters on July 17th carrying maps and a proposal. Rather than defend passively, 7th Army would drive northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's capital and principal port. The operation would cut the island in half, trap Italian forces in western Sicily, and secure port facilities, easing American supply difficulties. Alexander, perhaps surprised by Patton's initiative, or simply relieved to see American aggression directed away from Montgomery's operations, approved the proposal without apparent recognition that he was fundamentally altering the campaign's character. Rather than a single British advance up the east coast supported by American defensive operations, the Allies would now conduct two separate drives, Montgomery continuing toward Messina from south and east, Patton racing to Palermo before turning east to drive toward Messina along Sicily's northern coast. What began as strategic adjustment rapidly transformed into personal competition. Patton, determined to prove American capabilities and reach Messina before Montgomery, drove his command with characteristic intensity that bordered on recklessness. 7th Army moved with speed, shocking both allies and enemies, covering rugged terrain at rates Montgomery's methodical approach could never match. Just 12 days after landing, American troops entered Palermo on July 22nd, capturing Sicily's largest city and a major port in an operation demonstrating that American forces could conduct mobile warfare as effectively as any army in the world. Montgomery, meanwhile, continued grinding against German defences south of Mount Etna. His progress was measured, professional, and increasingly irrelevant to the campaign's outcome. German forces, recognizing Sicily could not be held indefinitely, had begun preparing evacuation to mainland Italy. The question was no longer whether Allies would conquer Sicily, but which Allied army would reach Messina first and claim symbolic victory. The race to Messina revealed character as much as capability. Patton pushed 7th Army to endurance limits, demanding relentless advance regardless of obstacles or mounting casualties. American engineers repaired roads and bridges with remarkable speed. American infantry marched through heat and mountainous terrain at paces leaving support units struggling to maintain contact. Patton's corps commanders, accustomed to his demanding style, drove their divisions hard, understanding that their commander's reputation and American military prestige hung on reaching Messina before the British. Montgomery's 8th Army, facing stronger opposition on more difficult terrain, advanced methodically. British commanders, trained to minimize casualties and husband resources stretched thin by 5 years of war, refused to risk disasters in pursuit of speed for its own sake. The contrast illustrated fundamental differences in American and British military cultures shaped by divergent circumstances. Americans, with vast manpower reserves and industrial capacity, could afford tactical risks and accept heavy casualties. British, fighting since 1939 with dwindling manpower and exhausted economy, could not afford losses that might cripple future operations. But the race also became intensely personal. Montgomery's public statements and private correspondence revealed that he considered 8th Army's mission more important and more difficult than 7th Army's operations. American success in reaching Palermo demonstrated nothing significant from Montgomery's perspective. Patton had faced weak Italian opposition in secondary terrain. 8th Army confronted veteran German troops in positions favouring defence. The comparison, Montgomery implied, was meaningless. American commanders interpreted such assessments as characteristic British condescension. They had heard similar evaluations in Tunisia. American successes were minimized, American difficulties explained by inexperience, American commanders patronized as enthusiastic but untutored. The attitude suggested that British respect for American arms remained purely conditional, extended only when American forces operated under British command, guidance, and for British objectives. On August 17, 1943, elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina several hours before British forces arrived from the south. 7th Army had won the race. But victory was hollow in ways reflecting the toxic state of Allied command relationships. Montgomery's public reaction combined graciousness with subtle dismissal. He congratulated Patton while emphasizing difficulties Eighth Army had faced and implying that terrain rather than competence explained differential outcomes. British press coverage reflected Montgomery's framing. Reports celebrated Eighth Army's fighting against Germans while treating Seventh Army's advance as a sideshow against inferior opposition. American achievements were acknowledged but diminished, presented as complementary to rather than equal with British operations. For American commanders reading these accounts, the message was unmistakable. British narratives would always centre British achievements regardless of objective evidence. Two incidents during Sicily's campaign further poisoned relationships. On August 3rd, and again on August 10th, Patton slapped hospitalised soldiers he accused of cowardice, triggering a scandal threatening his career. When word reached Montgomery, his response was coldly dismissive. Patton's behaviour confirmed British assumptions about American indiscipline and emotionalism. A British commander, Montgomery suggested, would never lose control in such fashion, implying that American command culture was fundamentally deficient. The second incident involved a young British Lieutenant Montgomery sent to 7th Army headquarters as liaison officer. The lieutenant arrived with a suitcase tied with string, presenting a shabby appearance that enraged Patton. Earlier, Patton had sent Montgomery a full liaison team, including a colonel, a major, and complete communications section. In exchange, Montgomery had dispatched a single junior officer with inadequate equipment. Patton sent the lieutenant back with a note explaining he could not permit boys in his headquarters. The incident was minor, almost comical in its pettiness, but it captured the casual disrespect characterizing Montgomery's treatment of American counterparts. Patton commanded an army equal in size to Montgomery's 8th Army. He deserved, by any standard of professional courtesy, liaison officers of appropriate rank and competence. Montgomery's failure to provide them suggested he viewed 7th Army as subordinate regardless of official command relationships. As Allied planners turned attention to Italy's invasion and eventually to Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France, one fact had become indisputable. Bernard Montgomery viewed himself as the preeminent Allied battlefield commander and expected deference from American colleagues accordingly. That American commanders increasingly viewed Montgomery as the primary obstacle to genuine Anglo-American partnership seemed not to register with the British Field Marshal. Or perhaps it simply did not matter to someone convinced of his own superiority. September 1st, 1944, found Allied breakout from Normandy, having shattered German defences in France, sending Wehrmacht forces reeling eastward in headlong retreat. Paris had been liberated on August 25th amid jubilant scenes seeming to confirm the war's imminent end. From Normandy beaches to Belgium, Allied armies pursued defeated enemies across terrain where, just months earlier, German forces had appeared unbeatable. Victory, perhaps by Christmas, seemed within grasp for optimistic commanders and journalists. For Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, recently promoted and basking in Normandy's glory, the moment demanded bold action. He had commanded all Allied ground forces during the Normandy invasion, a responsibility that, combined with earlier victories in North Africa and Sicily, confirmed his status as Britain's greatest battlefield commander. Now, with German armies in disarray, Montgomery saw opportunity to end the war with a single decisive thrust into Germany's industrial heartland. But September 1st also brought a change Montgomery resented with barely concealed fury. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, assumed personal command of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery, who had exercised operational control of both American and British armies during Normandy, was now reduced to commanding 21st Army Group, the British and Canadian forces fighting in northwest Europe. His American counterpart, General Omar Bradley, commanded 12th Army Group comprising American 1st, 3rd and 9th Armies. The change was inevitable. American forces in Europe now outnumbered British and Canadian troops substantially. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air power dominated European skies. American industrial capacity provided the material foundation for Allied victory. Political reality demanded American command of a coalition that had become overwhelmingly American in composition. Montgomery understood the politics, but accepted neither the necessity nor the implications. In his view, dispersing command authority among multiple headquarters diluted the decisive leadership victory required. Eisenhower, whatever his political skills, lacked battlefield experience to direct ground operations effectively. The Supreme Commander's role, Montgomery argued with increasing stridency, should be limited to political and logistical coordination. Operational command should remain concentrated in hands of a single ground forces commander possessing Montgomery's proven battlefield credentials. The proposal had one obvious beneficiary, Montgomery himself, but the Field Marshal presented his case as military necessity rather than personal ambition. Eisenhower's planned strategy, advancing into Germany on a broad front with multiple armies attacking simultaneously, was, Montgomery insisted, strategically unsound. It dispersed resources, prevented decisive concentration, and guaranteed the war would drag into 1945 with continued heavy casualties. Montgomery's alternative was characteristically bold and characteristically self-centered. Rather than broad front advance, Allies should concentrate forces for a single powerful thrust into northern Germany. This thrust would cross the Rhine, seize the Ruhr industrial region, and drive to Berlin before German forces could establish coherent defences. Montgomery would naturally command this decisive operation, with American forces providing support and protecting flanks while British troops delivered the knockout blow. The proposal's military merits were debatable at best. A narrow thrust deep into Germany would create an elongated salient vulnerable to counterattack from both flanks. It would require abandoning operations elsewhere, allowing German forces to concentrate against the advance. It depended on capturing bridges intact and maintaining supply lines over hundreds of miles of contested territory. Most fundamentally, it assumed German resistance had collapsed to the point where rapid advance would face minimal opposition, an assumption increasingly disconnected from battlefield realities. But the proposal's political implications were unmistakable and deeply offensive to American commanders. Montgomery was asking American political leaders to subordinate their armies to British command for an operation ensuring British forces, under British leadership, would deliver the decisive blow ending the war. He was requesting that American troops serve as Montgomery's shield while the British Field Marshal achieved final victory. And he was demanding that Eisenhower surrender operational control to a subordinate who made no secret of his contempt for the Supreme Commander's strategic judgment. Eisenhower, attempting to balance military necessities against coalition politics, compromised. He would not concentrate all forces for Montgomery's northern thrust, but he would give Montgomery priority for supplies and authorize a limited operation to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden, as the plan was designated, would employ 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British ground forces would then advance rapidly across captured bridges, establish a bridgehead over the Rhine, and position themselves for subsequent operations into Germany. For American commanders, particularly Bradley and Patton, Montgomery's latest scheme confirmed their worst suspicions. The Field Marshal was once again attempting to relegate American forces to supporting roles while British troops pursued glory. He was demanding supplies that might otherwise sustain American operations driving toward the German border. And he was proposing an operation whose risks seemed wildly disproportionate to potential gains, all to salvage Montgomery's reputation as the Alliance's premier battlefield commander. Patton, commanding Third Army driving toward Germany through eastern France, exploded when he learned fuel allocations were being shifted to Montgomery. His army had demonstrated during August that aggressive American operations could advance faster and farther than cautious British movements. Third Army was approaching the German border and potentially the Rhine River itself. Yet Eisenhower was halting American operations to resource a British Field Marshal whose track record suggested methodical caution rather than operational boldness. Bradley, normally more diplomatic than Patton, shared his subordinates' frustration. Montgomery consistently requested resources, threatened dire consequences if denied, and received priority regardless of American needs or achievements. The politics of coalition warfare, Bradley recognized, guaranteed that British demands would receive sympathetic hearings even as American forces provided the bulk of Allied combat power and casualties. September 17, 1944, Operation Market Garden commenced with the largest airborne operation in history. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers dropped from transport aircraft or glided into Dutch fields, tasked with seizing bridges before German forces could destroy them. British ground forces, led by 30th Corps, began advancing north along a single highway, racing to relieve airborne units before German counterattacks overwhelmed isolated paratroopers. The operation failed comprehensively on every level. Intelligence had detected German armour units near Arnhem, the northernmost objective, but these warnings were dismissed by planners convinced that German forces were too weak and demoralised to mount effective resistance. Airborne forces landed too far from their objectives, allowing Germans time to organise defences. The single highway became a death trap, with British armour unable to advance quickly or manoeuvre off roads bordered by marshland and canals. German resistance, far from collapsing, intensified as Wehrmacht commanders recognised the threat and rushed reinforcements to the battle. At Arnhem Bridge, British paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost held one end against overwhelming odds for days, expecting relief that never came. 30th Corps, stalled by German counterattacks and unable to bypass destroyed bridges, never reached Arnhem. By September 25th, when the operation was abandoned, over 17,000 Allied troops had been killed, wounded, or captured. The failure was total and undeniable. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defences in the Netherlands solidified. Allied momentum, which in early September had seemed unstoppable, dissipated in Dutch fields and along a highway the British would later call Hell's Highway. And the opportunity to end the war in 1944 evaporated in what would prove Montgomery's most catastrophic mistake. American reactions combined vindication with anger. Patton and Bradley had opposed Market Garden, arguing its risks outweighed potential benefits. They had suggested resources allocated to Montgomery's scheme would be better employed continuing American advances toward Germany. Their objections had been dismissed, overruled by political necessities and Montgomery's insistent certainty. Now, with Market Garden's failure undeniable, American commanders felt entitled to satisfaction that events had confirmed their judgment. But satisfaction was overwhelmed by fury at Montgomery's response to disaster. Rather than accepting responsibility for an operation he had conceived, planned, and commanded, Montgomery characterized Market Garden as 90% successful. The bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen had been captured. Allied forces had liberated substantial Dutch territory. That Arnhem, the operation's primary objective, had not been secured was presented as a minor setback in an otherwise triumphant campaign. The claim was breathtaking in its dishonesty. Market Garden's purpose was establishing a bridgehead over the Rhine. This had not been achieved. The operation had cost over 17,000 casualties for no strategic gain whatsoever. Yet Montgomery was declaring victory, rewriting failure as success through sheer force of personality and media manipulation. American commanders recognized the maneuver for what it was. Montgomery protecting his reputation at truth's cost. When Montgomery succeeded, credit was his alone. When operations faltered, explanations involved inadequate resources, insufficient support, or others' failures. Personal responsibility for setbacks was conspicuously absent from Montgomery's narrative, a pattern so consistent it could only be deliberate. But Montgomery's most egregious offence was still to come. In Market Garden's aftermath, as Allied operations transitioned to grinding advances against strengthened German defences, Montgomery began publicly criticising Eisenhower's strategy. The broad front approach, he argued in comments to British press and in signals to Churchill, had squandered opportunity for decisive victory. Had his plan been adopted, had he received requested resources and authority, the war would be over. The critique ignored inconvenient realities. Montgomery had received substantial resources for Market Garden. The operation's failure resulted from flawed planning, intelligence mistakes, and underestimating German capabilities rather than from inadequate support. But Montgomery's narrative transformed operational incompetence into missed opportunity supposedly caused by others' strategic short-sightedness. For American commanders, Montgomery's deflection confirmed the field marshal would never acknowledge personal error. Every setback became someone else's failure. Every success was his personal triumph. This pattern suggested not just vanity, but something more corrosive, a fundamental incapacity for honest self-assessment, making Montgomery dangerous to Allied unity, even as his tactical skills remained valuable. December 16, 1944, found dawn breaking over the Ardennes forest as German forces launched their last great offensive in the west. The assault, attacking through the Ardennes in a desperate gamble to split Allied armies and seize the vital port of Antwerp, achieved complete surprise. German spearheads smashed into thinly held American positions, creating a bulge in Allied lines that would give the battle its name. For 10 days, the outcome hung in balance as German spearheads drove toward the Meuse River, threatening to fracture Allied defences and prolong the war indefinitely. The Battle of the Bulge became Montgomery's finest and worst moment simultaneously. His military performance was exemplary in many respects. When Eisenhower transferred command of American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery on December 20th, the Field Marshal immediately imposed order on confused defensive operations. He positioned British reserves to defend Meuse crossings. He coordinated American counterattacks. He demonstrated, under genuine crisis conditions, why Britain valued his leadership and battlefield management skills. But Montgomery's conduct after the battle sowed bitterness persisting decades after the war's end. On January 7, 1945, with German forces in full retreat and Allied victory assured, Montgomery held a press conference ostensibly to praise American troops and defend Eisenhower against British critics. What emerged instead was a masterclass in self-promotion disguised as gracious compliment. Montgomery began by praising American soldiers' fighting qualities in terms suggesting surprise at their competence. But he quickly pivoted to describing his own actions upon taking command, actions presented as decisive interventions saving American forces from disaster. "As soon as I saw what was happening," Montgomery explained, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans reached the Meuse, they would certainly not cross that river." He continued describing how he had tidied up the battlefield, how he had thought ahead about potential German moves, how he had ensured balanced dispositions preventing breakthrough. The battle, Montgomery concluded, had been most interesting, possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. Throughout the recitation, British actions were highlighted, Montgomery's brilliance emphasized, and American commanders conspicuously absent from the narrative. The performance was calculated insult disguised as compliment. Montgomery praised American soldiers while implying they had been saved by his superior leadership. He credited American courage while suggesting American commanders had been overwhelmed by events until British professionalism imposed order. And he characterized a desperate defensive battle, won primarily by American units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and by Patton's rapid counterattack from the south, as a Montgomery triumph. American reaction was explosive and nearly destructive of the alliance. Bradley, reading press reports of the conference, felt profound betrayal cutting deeper than any previous insult. Montgomery had commanded 2 American armies for barely 3 weeks. Those armies had fought magnificently, holding against overwhelming odds until German offensive momentum exhausted itself. Patton's Third Army had executed a brilliant counterattack, pivoting 90 degrees in winter conditions to relieve Bastogne in an operation demonstrating operational excellence, matching anything in military history. American soldiers had paid in blood to defeat the German dictator's final gamble. Yet Montgomery's narrative minimized American contributions and elevated his own role to central importance. This was not merely vanity. It was historical theft, an attempt to rewrite American victory as British rescue. And it was, American commanders recognized, entirely characteristic of Montgomery's approach to coalition warfare. The press conference triggered something approaching command crisis. Bradley called Eisenhower, furious beyond diplomatic constraint. He could not, he declared, continue serving if Montgomery retained command of American forces. If Eisenhower intended giving the British Field Marshal permanent command over American armies, Bradley would resign. The ultimatum was not idle threat. Bradley, normally the most diplomatically skilled of American commanders, had reached his breaking point. Eisenhower, recognizing that Allied unity hung by a thread, attempted to calm Bradley while privately drafting a message to the combined chiefs of staff. In it, he stated plainly that he would request Montgomery's relief unless the Field Marshal apologized and ceased public criticisms. The war might be won, Eisenhower implied, but whether the alliance survived victory remained uncertain. The crisis was resolved only after intense British pressure forced Montgomery to recognize his error's magnitude. On January 12th, Montgomery wrote to Eisenhower expressing regret and acknowledging his press conference had caused offense. To Bradley, he sent a conciliatory letter praising American troops and expressing gratitude for the honor of commanding them temporarily. The letters were gracious, apparently sincere, and largely irrelevant. The damage was done. The wounds inflicted would never fully heal. American commanders now understood with absolute clarity that Montgomery would never view them as genuine partners. Every operation would be filtered through Montgomery's assessment of how it affected his reputation. Every failure would be explained by insufficient support or others' errors. Every success would be claimed as validation of Montgomery's wisdom. This pattern was fixed, predictable, and ultimately intolerable to commanders whose forces bore the alliance's primary burden. But more than personality clashes were at stake. By early 1945, the balance of forces in Europe had shifted so decisively toward American predominance that Montgomery's pretensions to battlefield supremacy had become not merely irritating but operationally counterproductive. American armies comprised over 60 divisions. British and Canadian forces numbered fewer than 20. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air power dominated European skies. Yet Montgomery continued behaving as though British wisdom must guide American strength. The contradiction reflected broader tensions in Anglo-American relations. Britain, exhausted by 5 years of war and facing post-war economic collapse, struggled to accept that its global predominance had ended. The United States, emerging as the world's dominant power, was discovering that military might created political responsibilities American traditions had not prepared it to assume. Montgomery's inability to adjust to these realities made him a symbol of Britain's difficulty accepting diminished status in a world being fundamentally reshaped by the war. Winston Churchill, watching Montgomery's press conference disaster unfold, recognized the danger to Anglo-American relations. He spoke in Parliament on January 18th, carefully calibrating his words to repair alliance relationships. The Battle of the Bulge, Churchill stated clearly, was predominantly an American battle, an American victory, and would be remembered as an ever-famous American triumph. British forces had played supporting roles, he acknowledged, but American troops had borne the battle's weight and deserved full credit for victory. Churchill's intervention helped contain the immediate crisis, but American commanders who worked with Montgomery through Germany's final conquest never again trusted his judgment or his motives. They recognized that coalition warfare with Montgomery required constant vigilance against his attempts to marginalize American contributions and claim disproportionate credit for shared victories. May 8, 1945, brought Germany's unconditional surrender. The European war was over. Victory belonged to an Allied coalition that had overcome not just fascist Germany, but also internal divisions repeatedly threatening to tear it apart. In peace's euphoria, old conflicts were temporarily submerged. Montgomery received accolades from a grateful British public. American commanders returned home to celebrations recognizing their achievements. But in memoirs and histories written after the war, conflicts resurfaced with renewed bitterness. Montgomery's published recollections, appearing in 1958, reignited old controversies by criticizing Eisenhower and implicitly claiming Montgomery's strategic vision had been superior. Eisenhower, then President of the United States, broke off personal contact, refusing to correspond with a former colleague who seemed determined to refight battles from a vanished war. Bradley's memoir, published in 1951, meticulously documented instances where Montgomery's conduct had undermined Allied operations. Patton's posthumously published diary revealed the depth of his contempt for the British Field Marshal. American histories of the war, drawing on these accounts and official records, presented Montgomery as talented but difficult, brilliant but insufferable, a commander whose contributions were real, but whose personality made him a liability to coalition warfare. British historians defended Montgomery, arguing American commanders never appreciated his methodical approach, his concern for casualties, his strategic sophistication. They noted Montgomery never lost a major battle after assuming command in North Africa. They emphasized his planning and preparation had made D-Day successful. They suggested American criticisms reflected jealousy of British professionalism and resentment of British military traditions, representing centuries of accumulated wisdom. The debate continued for decades after participants' deaths. Historians argued about Montgomery's true contributions, about whether American frustrations were justified, about how personalities affected military operations. Some concluded Montgomery was a great commander, poorly suited to coalition warfare. Others suggested American commanders, lacking Montgomery's experience, resented his superior judgment. Still others argued the conflicts reflected inevitable tensions when proud nations attempt cooperation in existential struggle. But beneath historiographical debates lay a simpler truth. One American commanders of the Second World War understood with crystalline clarity. Bernard Montgomery, for all his talents, could not treat American forces as equals. Whether this incapacity reflected personal psychology or British determination to maintain fading supremacy remained debatable. What was indisputable was that Montgomery's conduct poisoned Allied relationships and created unnecessary obstacles to coalition warfare. The American experience with Montgomery provided lessons outliving the war. Future coalition operations would be structured to prevent personality conflicts from undermining military effectiveness. Command arrangements would be designed to ensure proportional representation and prevent any nation from dominating simply through superior confidence or historical precedent. And American military culture would internalize wariness of allies who confused partnership with subordination. For Americans who fought alongside Montgomery from Tunisia to Germany, the Field Marshal represented what they believed had been left behind in 1776. The assumption that British wisdom must guide American strength, that colonial enthusiasm required metropolitan sophistication to succeed, that New World energy needed Old World experience to avoid disaster. They discovered that battlefield excellence, industrial might, and military success could not overcome cultural assumptions rooted in centuries of British global dominance. Montgomery never understood this truth. To his death in 1976, he maintained that his wartime conduct had been appropriate, his criticisms justified, his strategic vision superior to alternatives. He remained convinced Eisenhower's leadership had been inadequate, that American commanders had lacked his professional competence, that the war could have ended sooner had his advice been followed consistently. American commanders who survived him offered different verdicts. They acknowledged Montgomery's tactical skills, but questioned his strategic judgment. They praised his careful preparation, but noted wars are won by boldness as well as caution. They conceded his concern for casualties, but observed Montgomery's caution sometimes allowed enemies to escape destruction. And they concluded, with near unanimity, that Montgomery's personality made coalition warfare more difficult than necessary. The final assessment belonged to Eisenhower. Writing years after the war, he acknowledged Montgomery's abilities, but noted the field marshal's complete inability to understand political dimensions of coalition command. Montgomery, Eisenhower concluded, was a man whose military talents were undeniable, but whose lack of diplomatic sensitivity made him unsuited for senior command in Allied operations. It was perhaps the most devastating critique possible. Not that Montgomery lacked military competence, but that his virtues were overwhelmed by vices undermining the very cause he served. In coalition warfare, where personality affects effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's incapacity for treating allies as partners made him not merely difficult but dangerous to the alliance's cohesion. Americans learned this lesson through bitter experience, from North African sand to German mud. They discovered military alliances require more than shared enemies. They demand mutual respect, acknowledgement of partners' contributions, and willingness to subordinate ego to collective purpose. Montgomery, whatever his other qualities, could not meet these requirements. And in that failure lay the answer to why Americans developed such intense animosity toward the British Field Marshal. Not because he was British, not because he was cautious, but because he made them feel like colonial auxiliaries in a war they were winning, soldiers whose blood mattered but whose judgment did not, allies valued only insofar as they facilitated British glory. That memory outlasted Montgomery, outlasted the generation that served with him, outlasted even the Cold War alliance growing from wartime cooperation. It served as permanent reminder that technical excellence cannot substitute for human respect, that battlefield brilliance means little if it alienates those whose cooperation victory requires. Bernard Montgomery was many things: brilliant tactician, careful commander, British hero. But to Americans who fought alongside him, he was also a cautionary tale about the limits of military genius divorced from diplomatic wisdom and basic respect for comrades in arms.